I thought being invisible was my superpower. Blending into crowds, going unnoticed, avoiding confrontation. But when an elite CEO's wife humiliated me in front of everyone at Starbucks, I had no idea that moment would lead me to discover a billion-dollar conspiracy that would change everything. Sometimes the smallest acts of cruelty reveal the biggest secrets. Stay until the end because what happened next will leave you speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah, and 3 months ago, I was just another face in the crowd. I worked as a data analyst for a small marketing firm in downtown Seattle, the kind of job where you disappear into spreadsheets and nobody really notices if you're there or not. Every morning I'd take the same bus route, stop at the same Starbucks on Pine Street, order the same medium coffee with oat milk, and sit at the same corner table with my laptop. I liked being unremarkable. After growing up in foster care, bouncing between homes where standing out usually meant trouble, I'd learned that safety came from being forgettable. I wore neutral colors, kept my voice quiet, and made sure never to draw attention to myself. It was a survival mechanism that had served me well for 28 years. The Starbucks on Pine Street was my sanctuary. It was always busy enough that I could work in peace, surrounded by the comfortable buzz of other people's conversations. The baristas knew my order but not my name, which was exactly how I liked it. I'd found the perfect balance between being alone and being lonely, invisible but not isolated. That Tuesday morning started like every other. I grabbed my usual table near the window, pulled out my laptop, and settled in to review campaign analytics for our biggest client. The coffee shop was packed with the usual mix of tech workers, students, and tourists, everyone absorbed in their own little worlds. I was deep in concentration, analyzing click-through rates, when I heard raised voices near the counter. At first, I tried to ignore it. Confrontation made me physically uncomfortable, a leftover response from childhood homes where arguments often escalated quickly. But the voices grew louder, and I found myself glancing up despite my instincts to stay focused on my screen. Near the pickup counter stood a woman who commanded attention in a way I'd never experienced. She was tall, blonde, and dressed in clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her handbag alone looked like it could pay for my groceries for 6 months. Everything about her screamed wealth and privilege, from her perfectly manicured nails to her designer shoes that clicked authoritatively against the tile floor. She was berating a young barista about her order, her voice sharp and condescending. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she was saying, holding up a coffee cup like it was evidence in a court case. "I specifically asked for oat milk, not regular milk. Do you have any idea how this affects my dietary restrictions?" This level of incompetence is exactly why businesses like this fail. The barista, who couldn't have been more than 19, was visibly shaking as she tried to apologize and offer to remake the drink. But the woman wasn't interested in solutions. She seemed to be enjoying the power she held over this terrified teenager, the way everyone in the coffee shop was now watching her performance. "I don't have time for this," the woman continued, her voice rising even higher. "Do you understand who I am? My husband owns half the commercial real estate in this city. One phone call from me could shut this place down. Is that what you want? Do you want to explain to your manager why you've cost them everything?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt my chest tighten as I watched this display of cruelty. The woman was using her wealth and power to terrorize someone who was just trying to do her job, someone who had no way to fight back. The barista was close to tears, and other customers were either staring in shock or deliberately looking away, nobody willing to intervene. Something inside me shifted. Maybe it was seeing my younger self in that frightened barista, remembering all the times I'd been powerless against people who used their authority to hurt others. Maybe it was the sheer injustice of watching someone abuse their privilege to destroy another person's day. Or maybe I was just tired of being invisible when invisibility meant allowing cruelty to continue unchallenged. Before I could stop myself, I stood up and walked toward the counter. My legs felt unsteady, my heart was racing, but I couldn't sit there and watch this harassment continue. "Excuse me," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended but clear enough to be heard. The woman turned toward me with the kind of dismissive glance usually reserved for insects. Her eyes swept over my thrift store sweater, my worn jeans, my generic sneakers, and I could see her categorizing me as someone beneath her notice. "I'm sorry, were you speaking to me?" she asked, her tone suggesting that my very existence was an inconvenience. "I was just wondering if maybe you could give her a break," I said, nodding toward the barista. "It's just a coffee mistake. These things happen, and she's trying to fix it." My voice was still soft, non-confrontational, the way I'd learned to speak when I needed something from adults who held power over me. The woman's expression shifted from dismissive to incredulous, as if she couldn't believe someone like me had dared to address her. "Excuse me? Are you actually inserting yourself into a conversation that has nothing to do with you?" She took a step closer, and I could smell her expensive perfume, see the perfect application of her makeup, notice the way her jewelry caught the light. "I just think we could all be a little kinder to each other," I said, feeling the attention of everyone in the coffee shop focused on our interaction. My face was burning with embarrassment, but I couldn't back down now. The barista was looking at me with a mixture of gratitude and horror, clearly worried that I was about to make things worse for her. What happened next changed everything. The woman looked me up and down one more time, her lip curling in disgust. Then, without warning, she picked up her coffee cup and threw the entire contents directly at me. Hot coffee splashed across my chest, soaking through my sweater and burning my skin. The liquid was hot enough to make me gasp and step backward, but not hot enough to cause serious injury. The coffee shop went completely silent. Everyone stared in shock as coffee dripped from my hair, my clothes, pooling on the floor around my feet. I stood there, stunned and humiliated, feeling like that powerless child again, the one who learned that speaking up only brought punishment. "That's what happens when people like you forget their place," the woman said, her voice cold and satisfied. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before interfering in situations that are above your understanding." She grabbed her purse and headed toward the door, pausing only to add, "And maybe this establishment will learn to hire staff with actual competence." As she left, the coffee shop remained frozen for several seconds. Then suddenly everyone was moving, offering napkins, asking if I was okay, expressing outrage at what they'd witnessed. The barista who'd been terrorized moments before was now helping clean coffee from my sweater, tears in her eyes as she apologized over and over. "Please don't apologize," I told her as I accepted a towel from another customer. "None of this was your fault. That woman was completely out of line, and what she did to both of us was wrong." But even as I said the words, I felt the familiar shame of having drawn attention to myself, of having stepped outside the safe boundaries of invisibility. The manager appeared, horrified by what had happened, offering free coffee for a month, dry cleaning vouchers, anything to make up for the incident. Other customers were expressing their support, some even offering to be witnesses if I wanted to file a complaint. But all I wanted was to disappear, to go home and pretend this humiliation had never happened. I gathered my laptop and belongings, my sweater still damp and coffee-stained, and headed for the exit. As I pushed through the door, I heard someone behind me say, "That was Victoria Blackwood. Her husband is Marcus Blackwood, the real estate guy. She's always been awful, but I've never seen her do anything like that before." Victoria Blackwood. Now I had a name to go with the face that had just humiliated me in front of dozens of strangers. As I walked to the bus stop, my sweater clinging uncomfortably to my skin, I found myself thinking about her words. "People like you forget their place." What did that mean exactly? What place was I supposed to occupy? And who decided that her place was so far above mine that she could treat me like I wasn't even human? The bus ride home was miserable. I could feel other passengers glancing at my stained clothes, smell the coffee that had soaked into my hair. But underneath the humiliation, something else was growing. Anger. Real, clean anger at the injustice of what had happened. Not just to me, but to that young barista who'd been terrorized for making an honest mistake. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to stay below the radar, avoiding conflict, accepting whatever treatment came my way because I'd learned that fighting back usually made things worse. But Victoria Blackwood had crossed a line. She'd physically assaulted me for the crime of asking her to be kind to another person. And she'd done it with such casual cruelty, such certainty that there would be no consequences, that it revealed something deeply wrong about how she viewed the world. That night, I sat in my small apartment, having changed into clean clothes and washed the coffee from my hair, and found myself searching the internet for information about Victoria and Marcus Blackwood. What I found was a couple who seemed to embody everything wrong with extreme wealth and privilege. Marcus Blackwood was indeed a major player in Seattle real estate, but his success story was darker than the polished press releases suggested. There were hints of aggressive business practices, small competitors mysteriously losing financing, development projects that displaced entire communities without adequate compensation. He'd built his empire by crushing anyone who stood in his way, and Victoria seemed to be cut from the same cloth. Her social media was a showcase of conspicuous consumption and casual cruelty. Photos of expensive vacations were captioned with complaints about service staff. Charity events she attended seemed to be more about being photographed than actually helping anyone. In every image, every post, there was an underlying message that she was inherently superior to ordinary people, that her wealth made her more valuable as a human being. As I scrolled through years of posts, I began to see a pattern. Victoria wasn't just casually cruel, she was systematically destructive to anyone she perceived as beneath her. There were stories buried in comment threads about fired employees, ruined small businesses, families who'd been evicted from properties the Blackwoods had acquired. The coffee incident wasn't an aberration. It was just the first time I'd personally experienced the casual cruelty that seemed to define her existence. But I also noticed something else. For all their apparent power and success, there were cracks in the perfect image the Blackwoods projected. Financial filings that didn't quite add up. Business partnerships that ended in acrimonious lawsuits. Rumors about leverage and debt that suggested their empire might not be as solid as it appeared. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, following digital breadcrumbs that painted a picture of a couple who had built their success on the suffering of others. And somewhere in those dark hours, as I read story after story of people who'd been crushed by the Blackwood machine, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let Victoria Blackwood's assault on me disappear into the void. I wasn't going to accept that people like me had to tolerate abuse from people like her. I was going to fight back, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd been hurt by the casual cruelty of those who believed their wealth made them untouchable. I had no idea then that my decision to seek justice would uncover secrets that went far beyond one woman's cruelty. I couldn't have imagined that standing up to a bully in a coffee shop would lead me into the heart of a conspiracy involving billions of dollars, corrupt officials, and crimes that reached into the highest levels of power. All I knew was that I was tired of being invisible, tired of watching injustice happen without consequences, tired of accepting that some people could hurt others simply because they had more money. Victoria Blackwood had picked the wrong person to humiliate. She'd awakened something in me that had been sleeping for 28 years, and I was about to discover just how dangerous a truly motivated, invisible person could be. The next morning, I didn't go to my usual Starbucks. Instead, I sat in my apartment, coffee-stained sweater hanging in my closet as evidence, and began planning how an ordinary data analyst with no money, no connections, and no power could take on one of the most influential families in Seattle. I had no idea that across town, someone was watching me, someone who'd been waiting years for the right person to help him bring down the Blackwoods once and for all. What I didn't know was that my late-night research had triggered something I never expected. While I was digging into the Blackwoods business empire, someone else was digging into me. The next afternoon, as I sat in a different coffee shop across town, still too embarrassed to return to my usual spot, a man in an expensive suit approached my table. "Sarah Chen?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from years of success. Everything about him screamed wealth. But unlike Victoria Blackwood, there was warmth in his eyes, not cruelty. I looked up from my laptop, immediately on guard. "Who's asking?" After the humiliation with Victoria, I wasn't eager to engage with another wealthy stranger who might decide I wasn't worth basic human decency. "My name is David Harrison," he said, extending his hand. "I am the CEO of Harrison Industries. I was hoping we could talk about what happened to you yesterday at Starbucks." He gestured to the empty chair across from me. "May I sit down?" David Harrison. Even I recognized that name. Harrison Industries was one of the largest construction and development companies on the West Coast, a direct competitor to Marcus Blackwood's empire. I'd read about their rivalry in business journals, the way they'd been bidding against each other for major projects for years. "How do you know what happened to me?" I asked, not moving to invite him to sit. My instincts were screaming caution. Rich people didn't seek out data analysts unless they wanted something, and after yesterday, I wasn't inclined to trust anyone who operated in Victoria Blackwood's social circle. David's expression grew serious. "Because I've been investigating the Blackwoods for 3 years, and when someone posted a video of Victoria assaulting you online, it caught my attention." He pulled out his phone and showed me a clip that made my stomach drop. Someone had filmed the entire incident, from Victoria's initial tirade against the barista to her throwing coffee on me. "That video has been shared 12,000 times in the last 18 hours, David continued. "Victoria Blackwood just gave us the evidence we've been waiting for to prove what kind of people the Blackwoods really are." He paused, studying my face. "Sarah, I'd like to offer you a job." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "A job? I already have a job, and I don't understand what this has to do with anything." But even as I said it, I could feel my curiosity overriding my caution. There was something about David Harrison that felt different from other wealthy people I'd encountered. He was listening to me like my words mattered, looking at me like I was a person worth his time. "The Blackwoods aren't just cruel," David said, leaning forward slightly. "They're criminals. For years they've been running construction scams, laundering money through fake development projects, and bribing city officials to look the other way. But they're careful, sophisticated, and they have enough legitimate business to hide behind." He opened a briefcase I hadn't noticed him carrying and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been trying to build a case against them, but I need someone with your specific skills. Someone who can analyze data patterns, find connections that aren't obvious, trace financial flows through complex corporate structures." He slid the folder across the table. "Someone who's invisible enough to do the work without attracting attention." I opened the folder and found myself looking at financial documents, bank records, construction contracts, and city planning permits. Even at first glance, I could see irregularities, patterns that didn't make sense, numbers that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. "Why me?" I asked. "You could hire any forensic accountant, any financial investigator. People with credentials and experience." "Because the Blackwoods know all those people," David replied. "They've bought off half the investigators in the city, intimidated the other half. But you're someone they'll never see coming. You're exactly what Victoria thinks you are, invisible. And that makes you the most dangerous person in the world to them." As I flipped through the documents, I began to see the scope of what David was suggesting. This wasn't just about getting revenge for a humiliating incident in a coffee shop. This was about exposing a criminal enterprise that had been operating with impunity for years, hurting countless people while hiding behind wealth and influence. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said, though part of me already knew I was going to say yes. The analytical part of my brain was already seeing patterns in the financial data, inconsistencies that suggested systematic fraud on a massive scale. "I'm asking you to help me destroy them," David said simply. "Legally, completely, and permanently. I'm offering you a position as a senior data analyst with Harrison Industries, with a salary 3 times what you're making now, full benefits, and the resources to conduct the most important investigation of your career." He pulled out a check and placed it on the table. "This is a signing bonus. $50,000, just for agreeing to look at what we've uncovered so far." The amount was more money than I'd ever seen at one time, more than I made in an entire year at my current job. But it wasn't the money that convinced me. It was the memory of that young barista's terrified face, the casual cruelty in Victoria's voice when she'd said, "People like you." It was the thought of all the other people who'd been hurt by the Blackwoods. Empire, all the victims who'd never had anyone fight for them. "If I do this," I said carefully, "I want to know everything, all of it. I don't want to be kept in the dark about any aspect of this investigation." I was thinking about my years in foster care, the way adults had made decisions about my life without including me, the powerlessness of being someone else's pawn. David smiled, and for the first time since Victoria had humiliated me, I felt like someone was seeing me as an equal rather than a problem to be managed. "Sarah, this only works if you have complete access to everything we know. You'll be the lead investigator on this case." I'll provide resources and support, but this is your investigation. That afternoon, I walked into Harrison Industries, downtown offices, and into a world I'd never imagined. David's team included former FBI agents, retired prosecutors, and financial experts who'd spent years tracking white-collar crime. But what struck me most was how they welcomed me, how they treated my insights and observations as valuable from the very first meeting. "The Blackwoods have been careful," explained Janet Morrison, a former federal prosecutor who now worked as Harrison Industries' legal counsel. "They layer their crimes through multiple shell companies, use legitimate businesses to wash dirty money, and maintain enough actual real estate development to create plausible cover for their activities." She spread out a complex organizational chart showing dozens of interconnected companies, all somehow tied to the Blackwood empire. But they got sloppy about 6 months ago, greedy. They started taking bigger risks, cutting corners, and that's created vulnerabilities we can exploit. As Janet explained the legal framework of the investigation, I found myself studying the financial flows she'd mapped out. Even in that first hour, I could see patterns that seemed to have been missed, connections that weren't immediately obvious but became clear when you looked at the timing of transactions rather than just the amounts. "Here," I said, pointing to a series of payments between Blackwood Development and a company called Pacific Construction Services. "These payments happen every month, always for slightly different amounts, but they're too regular to be legitimate construction costs. And look at this." I traced another line of transactions. Pacific Construction Services doesn't seem to do any actual construction. Every payment they receive gets transferred within 48 hours to banks in 3 different states. The room went quiet as everyone studied what I'd spotted. "That's money laundering," said Marcus Webb, one of the former FBI agents. "Classic structuring to avoid federal reporting requirements." "Sarah, you just found something we've been looking for 6 months." Over the next 2 weeks, I dove deeper into the Blackwood financial empire than anyone had ever gone before. Working 16-hour days, fueled by coffee and determination, I began to uncover a criminal operation that was far more extensive than even David had suspected. The Blackwoods weren't just running construction scams. They were operating a sophisticated money laundering operation for drug cartels, using their real estate empire to clean millions of dollars in illegal profits. They'd bribed city officials to approve fraudulent development projects, then used those projects as cover for moving dirty money through the legitimate banking system. But the most shocking discovery came when I was analyzing property records for a low-income housing development that Blackwood Development had acquired through eminent domain. The residents had been evicted with minimal compensation, told their neighborhood was being redeveloped for the public good. Instead, the Blackwoods had torn down the affordable housing and built luxury condos, making millions in profit while displacing hundreds of families. Among the eviction records, I found a familiar name, Maria Santos, the young barista who'd been terrorized by Victoria. Her family had lost their home to Blackwood Development, forced to move to a neighborhood with worse schools and higher crime because they couldn't afford anything better after the minimal compensation they'd received. "They've been systematically destroying communities," I told David as we reviewed my findings. "Not just for profit, but as a way to hide their criminal operations. Every time they displace a community, they eliminate potential witnesses, people who might notice suspicious activity in their neighborhood." David's expression was grim as he reviewed the evidence I'd compiled. "Sarah, what you've uncovered here is enough to bring down their entire operation. Federal charges, state charges, civil lawsuits that will strip them of everything they own." He paused, looking directly at me. "But they're going to fight back, and they're going to fight dirty. Are you prepared for what that means?" I thought about Victoria's sneering face as she'd thrown coffee on me, her casual assumption that I was powerless to do anything about her cruelty. I thought about Maria Santos and her family, forced from their home so the Blackwoods could build another monument to their own greed. I thought about all the other victims, all the people who'd been hurt while the Blackwoods hid behind their wealth and influence. "I'm prepared," I said, and for the first time in my life I truly was. The invisible girl who'd learned to disappear was about to make herself very visible to some very powerful people, and she was going to make them pay for every life they'd destroyed. The next morning, we submitted our evidence to the FBI, the IRS, and the State Attorney General's office simultaneously. By noon, federal agents were executing search warrants at every Blackwood property in 3 states. By evening, Marcus and Victoria Blackwood were in custody. charged with money laundering, racketeering, bribery, and fraud. The woman who'd thrown coffee on me for asking her to be kind was now facing 25 years in federal prison. The empire they'd built on the suffering of others was crumbling, and I'd been the one to find the cracks that brought it all down. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came a week later, when I walked back into that Starbucks on Pine Street. Maria Santos was working behind the counter, and when she saw me, her face lit up with recognition. "You're the woman who stood up to that horrible lady," she said. "I heard what happened to her on the news. I heard she got arrested." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "My family got our house back. Turns out, when criminals buy property with stolen money, the victims get compensated. We're moving home next month." As I sat at my old table with my coffee, watching Maria work with a smile I'd never seen before, I realized that invisibility had never been my superpower. My real power was in seeing what others missed, in caring enough to fight for justice even when it seemed impossible, in refusing to accept that cruelty was just the way the world worked. Victoria Blackwood had been wrong about people like me knowing our place. My place wasn't invisible in the corner, accepting whatever treatment came my way. My place was standing up for what was right, using my skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, making sure that wealth and privilege didn't shield anyone from the consequences of their actions. Sometimes the smallest act of courage, like asking someone to be kind, can lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes standing up to a bully in a coffee shop can bring down a criminal empire. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person who can see what everyone else misses. The Blackwoods had built their empire on the assumption that ordinary people were powerless against extraordinary wealth. They'd forgotten that ordinary people, when they work together, when they refuse to be intimidated, when they insist on justice, are the most powerful force in the world. I'm not invisible anymore, and I never want to be again. I've learned that true power doesn't come from wealth or status or the ability to hurt others without consequences. True power comes from having the courage to do what's right, even when it's scary, even when it seems impossible, even when the odds are stacked against you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.